Let me perhaps talk about existentialism by sharing with you a story, and then we'll go from there. And the story comes from one of my good friends. I never had the pleasure of meeting him, but only through his books. And I haven't really read very many of his writings either, maybe a paragraph here and there for the past 30, 40 years. His name is Frederick Nietzsche. Nietzsche is German. He died relatively young, and he died having gone insane. He got sick. He also became a professor at the university at a very young age, 24. He had, I think, 5 or 6 or 7 or 20 sisters, so he was the only male, I think, in his household. He is the product of the 19th century. So before we can talk about Frederick Nietzsche, you have to understand that all of us are the product of our time. If, for example, you happen to be homosexual, there would be a good chance that you would never come out if it was the 1920s or 30s or 40s or 50s or 60s or 70s or 80s. Because then you had to confront with the wrath of your parents, your grandparents, your society, all that stuff. But now, in 2022, you can come out and claim to be whatever you want to be. People may scream and shout, but eventually you'll be hopefully accepted. So the point I'm trying to make that whatever you may think life to be, whatever you may think yourself to be, you can't exempt yourself from time and history. You are its product. Okay? So if you were to live in India or Nepal, there's a good chance that you would have a good amount of religious emotions inside you. You would have a good amount of religious philosophies inside you. And Alex, good morning. And then that would be your blender. You know, every experience you would have in life would go through this blender of religion and philosophy and culture and tradition and customs and rituals. But that's not your culture. You are an American living in America in the 21st century, in 2022. And if I want to get to know, or if I'm interested in knowing who and what you are, all I need to do is not so much getting to know you, but rather looking at the culture and see what components exist in this culture. If you're surrounded by pornographic images, there's a good chance your addiction will be pornography. If everywhere you walk, people are smoking, there's a good chance that you're also smoking. If you have a good number of friends who are watching Sopranos, there's a good chance that that's what you'll be watching. If your parents go to church and everyone around you goes to church, there's a good chance that you'll go to church. So you are known by the environment you occupy. Okay, so it's not very difficult to get to know people, how they function, how they think, and how they blend things. Now, let me say a few things about the 19th century, because 19th century is the child of the 18th century. 18th century is the child of the 17th century. 17th is the child of the 16th, 15th, 14th, 13th, and so on and so forth. What you need to know, though, is the following. There was an emperor in Rome, Constantine. After having a few dreams, after coming to realize that he's losing political power in Rome, he does something really interesting. And Rome has a pagan culture. They just walk around creating images and worshiping those images. Some images are down here, some images are up there, but gods very much behave and act like human beings. So after having some political difficulties and some dreams, of course, dreams about seeing the sun, in the middle of the sun, seeing crosses, he perhaps comes to realize that perhaps Christianity is the only religion. Perhaps Jesus Christ is the Messiah. He is, in fact, God. And the Roman culture prior to Constantine, they believed in sons of God. They believe in Augustus being the son of God in Rome. In fact, there was a statue in Rome that proclaimed that if you want to understand truth, if you want to get to God, you have to go through Augustus, son of God. Once Constantine declares that Christianity is to be the official religion of Rome and ultimately the entire Western Hemisphere, You have, for the first time, the creation and the buildings of many, many churches going around. Christianity becomes a dominant religion. It becomes a dominant blender. You want to know why you suffer in this life? It's because of God. You want to know why you're poor? It's because of God. You want to know why your life is so miserable? You're born in sin, and this is the price you pay. You want to know what your salvation is? It's not Buddhism, it's not Judaism, it's none of those things. It's only Jesus Christ. And this way of thinking lasts for about 1,000 years. You want to know the meaning of your life, Ivy? Read Genesis. You're a fallen angel. This world is not to bring you happiness. Your body is going to be a container of temptation, and you're going to fall to these temptations. You'll have the 7 deadly sins within you. Pride, there is nothing to be proud of, just in case you have pride inside you. You know, you can raise your hand and say, I'm very proud to be a smoker. I'm very proud to be independent. I'm very proud to be emancipated from my parents, or whatever it is that you want to call it. Pride is kind of frowned upon, okay? Now, for 1,000 years, people's minds are conditioned, wired to think religiously, to feel religiously, to process everything religiously. Now, many scholars call this period, this 1,000 years period, as the Dark Ages. I don't think it's true. Your generation, Ivy, you have to spend the rest of your life trying to figure out what the hell to do with your life, who you are, what you are, what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong. For 1,000 years, people just knew. They believed in the Bible. They had faith in the Bible. They had fear of God. Will you have sex before marriage? No. Why? God said so. You have no right to ask questions. Does God exist? Is he right? None of those things in your culture. Am I straight or am I gay? You don't ask those questions. You're straight, period. And even if you're gay, you do what happened in Brokeback Mountain, the movie. Behind closed doors, do whatever you want. God is everywhere, man. You know. I'm not talking about the rightness or wrongness of the 1,000 years. All I'm saying is that meaning was already there for people. They didn't need to go on a quest to figure out who and what they are. You know, if you happen to be Russell in the 13th, 14th century, you send your kids to school, and they would come back. Their education would be all about God, the Old Testament, the New Testament, Jesus Christ. That's all. Would he complain? No, he would love those things. Something really interesting happened. Now, the other thing you need to know about this period is this. Art submitted itself to religion. How do you define art? Religious education. People don't know how to read. People don't know how to write. So how do you tell them the story of the Bible? You engrave it on the church door. You make paintings. You make stained glasses. You sing. You don't just speak the New Testament. You sing it. So when in this class you ask about, can you explain what art is? Well, what period are you talking about? Because art really for 1,000 years had only one function: to educate people about what it means to be a human being within the context of religious ideas and religious philosophy. That's it. You didn't have to read books about the temptations. Art would do that for you. Around the 13th century, and some people take it back all the way to the 11th century for certain events to have happened, but I'm just going to talk about the 13th century real quick. You have the presence of this virus. It's kind of like the pandemic we have today. You know, it killed almost 70 million people, half the population of Europe. You know, for 1,000 years, you believe that God is just, God is compassionate, God is forgiving. Everything that takes place down here is designed by God, God's mind. He makes things happen. And then you look everywhere and there is devastation. People are just dying. The prostitute who sells her body or his body to make a few bucks, he's healthy. The convent or the monastery that has housed nuns or monks for hundreds of years, everyone's dead. And then you sit back and you say, are you telling me that God favors prostitutes over monks and nuns? And for the first time, you have this question that now begins to live inside the minds of the masses. Does God really exist? Is God really fair? Is God really just? Why would God allow this to happen? And one of the best books that you will ever read in your life, if you haven't already, that talks about the difficulties of asking these questions, you can find it in this book by Albert Camus, the existentialist Algerian philosopher. The book is called, the novel is called The Plague. To just give you a very, very crude summary of what this book is trying to say, at least my interpretation is this. You have a journalist, you have a doctor, you have a priest, and you have a cab driver. What do journalists do? They're like you guys. You sit back and you take notes. It's good gossip, don't get me wrong. You take notes. You're not involved, but you take notes. You know why? Because you want to go home and tell your people what we talked about in class. You're not going to feel the stuff. You won't really reflect on it too much. And if you do, you make sure that doesn't increase or doesn't create pain inside you, because it's going to be very uncomfortable for you. So you can say that there are certain groups in society that just like to do that. They like to sit on the bench, look at the football players, hit each other, have concussion, and they simply stand up and they applaud, they sigh. That's what they do. They're spectators. That's what journalists do. Then there is a doctor. I don't know how you guys see doctors, but for the longest time, doctors were seen like messiahs. They knew everything you need to know about the human body. They would ask you all these really interesting questions. So you're sick. Did you have some food? Yes. What kind of food? Well, this kind of food. And what kind of plate? How's your father? Does he cough as well? They would get to know the entire family, and then they would give you a prescription. Then there is a priest. If you have the doctor who knows everything that you need to know about the human body, the priest knows everything you need to know about the mind of God and the human soul. And there is a cab driver. And this is not what Camus says, it's just my own blender, my own interpretation. A cab driver is someone who gives a ride to a journalist, who gives a ride to a doctor, who gives a ride to a priest, and a countless of other people occupying different branches of life. All of a sudden, in a tiny little city or village in France, a virus comes in and it begins to kill people. They get really, really sick. And it's a painful death. No one can leave the city, It's barricaded. They don't want other parts of France to catch this virus. And so people are just locked in. The journalists, you and I, sit back and watch this horror show, and we just write. I'm dying, Ivy. Ashanti, Joseph, it's good to see you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Have you told your friends I have cancer? You should. You're hearing it from me, firsthand. Tell it to your mom and dad and your friends. That would make you a good journalist. You may write about it. You may even think about it. But you have no idea how it feels to slowly have life sucked out of you, to leave things behind. And then when you look back, you realize your life is unfinished. But you're a good journalist. Do you know what it means to write from a distance? You see, you may even feel, but you're not consumed by the feelings. Your hands don't get dirty. You know, it's very different to see war than being in war. You have no idea how it feels to be Middle Eastern in an environment dominated by whites. You have no idea how it feels to be African American dominated by whites. You have no idea how it feels to be white in an environment dominated by blacks or Middle Easterners. But we can write about it in a very exciting, creative, inspiring way. It's not difficult to be a journalist. You can write well, you just don't understand. Then there is a doctor. Let me backtrack. You know, when this man just writes and writes and writes, after a while the emotions get to him. I mean, how long can you write about the suffering of people? Eventually it's going to touch you, man. You're going to come to realize whatever you write is irrelevant. It's insignificant. It means absolutely nothing. Do you know how you get depressed? First, there is a disturbance. Then it becomes more and more intense. You talk to Alex, then you talk to Joaquin, then you talk to Russell, then you talk to your mom, then you talk to Shanti. After a while, you just get tired of hearing your own voice and hearing the same goddamn story. Then you know what you do? You don't say anything to anyone. And then you don't even know what to do with the stuff that lives inside you. Then speech abandons you, or you abandon speech. Then you just lock yourself in your room, and you don't read, you don't talk, you don't listen, the lights are turned off, you don't eat. And for the first time you realize there is no outlet for you except just sleeping. Do you know what happens if you have been a journalist for 5, 10, 15, 20 years to come to realize words no longer have any power? There is nothing to say. The pain is far too intense, far too grand. It doesn't fit language anymore. And so what if someone in America can read what's happening in France? You and I have seen images from Somalia, Rwanda, the Middle East, certain parts of Oakland where people are dying left and right. It's sad. But 10 minutes later, you're sitting watching Seinfeld. To feel incompetent is a horrifying place to be. To feel irrelevant, to feel meaningless. Then you have a doctor. Hello. I like him. The doctor goes every single day to the hospital. For what? To cure the sick. To make sure people don't die under his watch. You're no doctor, Ivy. You still need to finish high school. You finish high school, you go to college, you go to 4-year school, then you go to the medical school. It's a 15, 20-year process. And then you get a job at Kaiser or some forsaken place, and you assume that you know everything needs to be known about how to heal the human being, his body. And you've cured some patients. You've made them feel better, so you have a profoundly inflated ego. You think very highly of yourself. And when this virus hits and people are dying left and right, how's that going to make you feel? 30 years of going to school, 20 years of experience, you amount to nothing. You know nothing about life. You know nothing about death. You know nothing about human body. You know nothing about this virus. All you know is that this virus makes you feel uneducated, incompetent. So the doctor suffers the same fate as the journalist. It's meaningless. Not to mention that death makes everything meaningless. And then you have the priest. Religious people are interesting. About 20 years ago, I had a student who gave me a poster that I've hung on the bathroom wall. The title of this poster is "Shit Happens." I'm sure some of you have seen it. Shit happens because Yahweh wants it. Shit happens because the Buddha wants it. Everything that happens is because some higher power wants it. It's nice to be religious-minded because you will never take responsibility for anything. Racism is the will of God. Poverty, will of God. My wife left me, will of God. I suck as a human being, will of God. I'm sure there is something for me to learn. You may be able to explain death away by religious ideas or theologies or philosophies, maybe once, maybe twice, maybe thrice. You can see a 70-year-old die, you say, well, he's lived his life. You can even watch a 20-year-old die and say, well, they had crummy parents, lived in a crummy society. It's best for him to die, really, than to live out his life in this culture and get sick and then die a miserable death. But a 2-month-old baby who has committed no crime against anyone, hasn't even lived long enough to commit any sins, how the hell do you explain his death away religiously? God wills it? Why would God will the death of a 2-year-old? Is God crazy? So the doctor allows the journalist in the hospital room and says, just write about what's happening here. And the journalist writes. And there comes a point the doctor says, I'm tired of people dying under my watch and me being able to do absolutely nothing. He looks at the journalist very angrily and says, throw your pen and notepad down. Come and give me a hand. Help me. And for the first time, the journalist gets his hand dirty and doesn't like it. And is in fact disgusted by his past. And how could he go to war zones? How could he so casually write about death and not be impacted? Because ultimately when you're around death, the most important that needs to happen to you, if you witness death quite often, is it pushes you back. It pushes you to sit. And it forces you to ask this question, Ivy, if you're going to die, how should you live your life? What is the most meaningful way of living your life? What should you do with the 2-3 hours that life has given you? Should you be casual? Should you be intense? Should you laugh for stupid things? Should you always be frowning? Should you always be reflective? Should you be casual? Should you be serious? Who should your friends be? How should you treat your parents? And the other thing about death is that it removes all ridiculous small questions. You know why there is racism? People don't think enough about death. You know why there is stupidity? People don't think enough death. Do you know why you take ridiculous, stupid classes? You don't think enough about death, that your life could end at any time. Do you know why you smile and you laugh? And you don't do it because you're satirical. You do it because you're just forgetful. And you're forgetful because you're stupid. And you're stupid because you don't reflect, contemplate on death, that your life could disappear at any time. Then as kids die under the watch of the doctor, comes in the priest. And he looks at the doctor and the journalist and says, oh, well, this kid is dying because God wants to save him from future sin. And there comes a point, man, this doctor can no longer hear this garbage. One morning he goes, grabs the priest by the neck, pulls him to the hospital, forces his head down to look into this crib, and it's a month and a half old baby, screaming. His body is filled with boils, profoundly painful. And he looks at this priest and says, tell me, why would God do this to this child? It all of a sudden hits the priest that he has no answers. In fact, God doesn't have the right to inflict so much pain on this infant. So you know what the priest does? He explains it away, but he knows he's been a fake. He goes to the cemetery where the bulldozers have dug this hole. He lays in this hole. In the morning, the bulldozer comes and fills the hole with gravel. The priest commits suicide. The only person that remains now is the cab driver. By the time you get to the cab driver, the city announces that the virus has disappeared. The barricades are removed, and they say, you guys can go wherever you want to. The virus has disappeared, kind of like the pandemic today. The cab driver, on the other hand, goes on top of this building and begins to shoot at people. And they catch him. They say, what the hell are you doing? It's time to celebrate, to rejoice. Why are you making people's lives more miserable? And the cab driver, and I'm paraphrasing, and I may be completely wrong about the way I'm interpreting the story, but he says, the plague hasn't gone. It hasn't really disappeared. It's on vacation for only a couple of days. It's bound to come back. And you better find an answer to combat this virus when it comes back, because if you don't, it's going to devastate this town again. You're 18 and you ask this question, what's the meaning of my life? I feel completely depressed. That's a virus, man. You stop reading books. You stop writing about it in your journal. You stop talking about it to your friends. You sit in your room, turn off the lights. Then you find yourself in this mood. For some strange reason, you feel happy. Alex calls you and says, let's go have coffee. You say, yeah, goddammit, let's go have coffee. And you guys have fun. And then comes Joaquin. He's surprised to see you. So what are you doing here, Ivy? Having a good time, man. Why don't you join us? He looks at you and says, what a fool you are. You've been depressed for 15 of your 18 years. And you think what? A day of laughter is going to take over 15 years? That's not going to happen. You just have a good mood. It's going to go away quickly. Depression is going to come back. And what Camus is alluding to is figuring out what the meaning to life is immensely difficult. And don't think that just because you're able to distract yourself cleverly, cunningly today, that you have found an adequate answer to what the meaning of your life is, what you should do for the next 20, 30, 40 years. The virus will come back. It'll happen when you get married. It'll happen when you have children. It'll happen when you have a job at a cubicle. It'll happen when your wife leaves you. It's called the plague. Never leaves. That's the 13th century. Everything turns upside down. All the answers we had, it disappears. You ask Russell, who are you? I'm a married man. Do you have children? Yeah, I'm a father of 4. You see how he identifies himself? He's married, father of 4. He has a job. Imagine if all those answers went into trash. Russell, who are you? I used to be married and not anymore. I used to be a father, not anymore. I used to be a vet, not anymore. I don't know who I am. Do you know the confusion that would kind of hover over his head? It would demolish him. It would enter into depression. That's the 13th century. People are beginning to ask difficult questions, and it's devastating. Do you know why sometimes people don't like coming to my classes? I don't give out information. I don't care for information. I want you to feel what lives inside the time period, what lives inside an idea. I don't want you to be a journalist simply taking notes and assume that taking notes equals education, learning. It doesn't work that way. You want to learn? Pain. Pain, reflection. And when you reflect, you realize how incompetent you are because you don't know anything about anything. Then comes Galileo. You know, for the longest time, science, philosophy, art, the other thing you should know about the 1,000 years of what they call the Dark Ages, the moment Christianity became the official religion of the West, they shut down all schools of philosophy. Anyone who would encourage thinking, reflecting, examining, they were crucified. Why? Thinking is dangerous. Why? We kill Malcolm X because he's a good-looking guy? We put Jesus Christ on the cross, why? Because he had a nice beard? They force us to think. And when you think passionately, intensely, honestly, sincerely, it's like an earthquake. The earth opens up and you realize you're being swallowed up. Galileo does something awful. Awful, awful. And that's the problem with artists, you know. They can't keep their art to themselves. They're like Socrates, always going around causing problems. Galileo comes forth and says, for all these thousands of years, we have believed that the sun revolves around the earth. Why? Read Genesis. Everything down here was created for us human beings. That's what Genesis tells us. God doesn't inject his spirit into a cow, a lizard, the mountain. No, nothing. Only the human being. And if you were to be very specific, only man. Nothing else on this planet is sacred. The only sacred thing is the human beings. That's the only thing. God created this thing for us, man. We are the very center of the universe. God cares for us. He doesn't create heaven and hell for animals, just for human beings. The Ten Commandments does not exist for animals, only for human beings. Why? God cares for us.